Today we're working with one of the most ancient of all conundrums, really, on the spiritual path, which is the Garden of Eden, and the tree which is planted within us, which gives us the knowledge of good and evil, and the endless ramifications from that story that have just been spread out. Once we were good, now we are terrible, now we have to be redeemed. Everything that we want to do is sinful, and the only things that are good are the things that we don't want to do. That's why there aren't that many people in this room. Much of the time when people would come for beginning meditation classes, I, being a devotee, having the pictures of the masters on the wall, prayer, everything being a part of it, sometimes people would feel the need to tell me that they didn't believe in God, that they were agnostic at best or vehemently atheists, and they were only there to get rid of their stress. They really didn't want any of the rest of it. So I would often ask them, what God do you not believe in? And they would explain to me the God they didn't believe in, and I would pretty much agree that I didn't believe in that God either. Any thinking person with any spunk wouldn't. Otherwise, you just live in this terrible, oppressive world. Right now, it's Sunday morning, and the number of people who are actually following the long-standing American custom of spending that time in a church is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where it's just not respected anywhere. Public schools schedule their soccer matches on Sunday mornings. I mean, even just in my relatively short, my long lifetime, let's be frank. In my childhood, it was unthinkable. We were Jewish. People cheerfully did things on Saturday. They didn't respect our Sabbath, but it wasn't a big deal to me one way or another. But the Christian Sabbath was absolutely honored. There was just no possibility that a public school would schedule a sporting event during church time. Now no one even thinks about it. I mean, we're in a very interesting period of time. And the paradox of it, though, is that people are, quote, less religious and more spiritual. That's what all the polls tell us. And of course, the polls are always accurate. This is what people say. There is a deep, deep hunger for meaning, an increasing hunger for meaning as the society around us embraces more and more chaotic values to the point where we don't even think it odd. I was in my car coming to Temple this morning, and just at the stoplight there was a car next to me. I thought the man was having an epileptic fit, and I was concerned that it would be unsafe for him to keep driving. But in fact, he was listening to something on the radio, and he was merely responding to the rhythm. But it took me a few minutes to realize that that's actually what was going on. Watching it with no context, you really thought his nervous system was just breaking apart, which it was. But it's now, this is the world we live in, where, I read a very touching article about a woman who has made her career in the pornography industry, and now she's really upset because Netflix is taking over her space, right? And nobody thinks it odd, and we wonder why our young people are so dismayed. When I was graduating from high school, President Kennedy had been assassinated, maybe my junior year, I'm not quite sure, but right there in my high school time. That was such a devastating experience that it was sufficient. I didn't need much incentive for me to explain to my father that I was never going to enter the world he was living in, ever. And I tried to tell him how, just give him that as an example, the assassination of the U.S. president. It's child's play now. At the same time, I'm not standing up here to depress us. Here it says in our reading today, reading from the Bible, that God has planted within us the tree of life, and with it comes the knowledge of good and evil. Now, I was starting to talk about all the different ways that good and evil is described. Some people call it purely sexuality. It's like when we're pure, we're not sexual. When we're impure, we're sexual. That one doesn't go over very well either. And that's compelled a lot of people not to believe in the God who told them that. Especially young people are not real impressed with that particular teaching. But there it is, the knowledge of good and evil. And I was just hearing it today in a completely different way because I've never understood. I've read Yogananda's description of what that it all means. It's in Autobiography of a Yogi. You know, there's a lot of words in Autobiography of a Yogi and in lots of other wonderful spiritual books, and I don't understand all the words. Fortunately, Master told us that of all his teachings, we only have to do 1%. I thought for years we had to do 10%, and then recently it was corrected down to 1%. I mean, think about that for just a minute. Of all the possible things that we could practice, we only have to do 1%. And that's not because we're extra advanced. It's because we're all so different. Just I'm looking at all your faces, and you all know what everybody's face looks like. Everybody is recognizable. Even identical twins, after a time, become recognizable because we all have this unique vibration within us and this unique destiny built up over countless lifetimes in which we find a way of moving through this world which is just exactly ours. And it's really, when you can enjoy it from the right side, it's just fascinatingly wonderful how this is. And yet, at the same time, we are all really made exactly the same. I mean, all of us suffer heartbreak, all of us suffer loneliness, all of us rejoice when we're loved and we're understood. They just make countless things so that even though the differences are legion, the similarities are far greater. We find happiness in the same way. So what was planted within us by the divine, calling it the knowledge of good and evil, it's exactly how Master described the essence of spiritual life. And the essence of spiritual life is not who interprets the Bible in a certain way and all the dogmas and all the I believes, all of those things. It's not at all. It's that human beings are made in a really simple way. We desire to experience happiness. We desire to avoid suffering. And true spiritual life, it cooperates with who we are. It doesn't contradict who we are. And the reason why spiritual life has any appeal at all is because it appeals to that fundamental need to avoid suffering and to find happiness. And what makes it different than anything else is that it isn't a matter of opinion. It's not a question of democracy. It's not everybody getting together and if 51% say this is true. It's a matter of our actual experience. And in a very real sense, the complete disintegration of institutionalized religious belief, dogmatic religious belief, is a great step forward. Because as Swami put it very simply, people are making their own actual experience the criteria for our lives. When the counterculture young people, of which I was an able representative back in the day, having a conversation with Swamiji and what we called then the sexual revolution, which is so tame compared to what's going on now, but at our days it was really a big deal. what do you think about that, Swami Kriyananda? You know, it's sort of like this youthful challenge. Then he says, overall, I think it's a good thing, which was not at all the response that anybody expected. Because, he said, people are making their own experience the criteria of their understanding of truth. Because if you're only taking somebody else's word for it, as soon as somebody more persuasive than you comes along, you'll just change your mind. When Ananda was in the midst of this 12 years of litigation, which culminated in an enormous character assassination lawsuit of the worst possible kind, which took place right here in Redwood City, and was on the front page of the Daily Rag every day. This was during the 90s. We'd get up in the morning to see whether we were on the front page or the next page or the next page, and it was all about Kriyananda, and it was about the Swami's treasure and the Swami's harem and the Swami's cult. And they would just find the most unflattering pictures of poor Swamiji and put them in the paper. And one of the brave souls who joined our cult during that period of time, she was actually sitting with her father in the dentist's office, and he picked up the local rag and he saw the search for the Swami's treasure with this horrible-looking man there. And the father said to the daughter, "Who would be stupid enough to get involved with these people?" And she said, "Well, Dad, I wanted to tell you that I just became a member of that group." It was perfect. Couldn't have been more perfect. Because she came, she felt it, she saw, she experienced. But when people would come to me, and I was highly knowledgeable because I was part of the little legal team, we had to, the client was bigger than, we had a crowd of us who had full knowledge, small crowd who had full knowledge. You have to, it's not even worth explaining, but it's just complicated. So I had full information, and people would come to me. I made no effort to persuade. Absolutely none. I made great effort to inform, in full detail, I wanted to inform, but I made no effort to persuade. Because if I could persuade you, then someone else could persuade you. And so you'll be persuaded by me today and persuaded by them tomorrow. And where will we be then? We'll just always be bouncing along with somebody else's ideas, and we'll be constantly a victim of the world around us. Where does suffering come from, and where does happiness come from? Suffering comes from being bounced along by the world around us. Think about it. Just things happen, and all of a sudden our happiness is taken away from us. Something else happens, and our happiness is back, and then tomorrow something else. It's Master, was it, I believe? Or maybe it was Satya Sai Baba. Pleasure is the interval between two pains. Pain is the interval between two pleasures. If we live outside ourselves, but what is planted within us is the knowledge of where happiness comes from and what causes pain. But it's not so obvious. And why God made it this way, I cannot possibly answer. It's an awful system. I really do think it is. People suffer so much. I suffer so much. Why just talk about you? Let's talk about me. I remember telling Swamiji, I've had a very blessed life. I've had an exceedingly blessed life, and including I had a very nice upbringing. And, I'm lucky. I have positive karma. But I met Swamiji when I was 22. I was absolutely instantly drawn to this path because my entire life, from as young as I can remember, I was determined that I needed to understand happiness. And it was like this, I had this intense desire to be happy, which was ironic because I was. It's like, where did this intense drive come to have something that I apparently already had? I was a cheery sort, when everything settled down, I would sort of bob up like a cork to the top. I had my bad days, but it was great. When I saw Swamiji finally, I could ask him so many questions that I could never ask anyone else because no one could answer me. I started into college. I actually went to Stanford at a time when it wasn't so hard to get in, I have to say that. But after 2 weeks, These people were smart. I mean, they were brainy people. Their IQ tests were probably much higher than mine, and they had vast information that I had no connection to. But they didn't know how to be happy. They just didn't know how to be happy. And I thought, what good is all of this? Because in the end, if you're suffering and you don't have happiness, what do you have? You can have status, you can have power, you can have money, you can have security, you can have the whole world telling you how great you are. But we don't live outside, we live inside. This is Genesis. Planted within us is the tree of life with the knowledge of good and evil. And what makes something evil? It causes suffering. And Swamiji remarked once just so astutely, if we exercise some hurtful words or actions, it eventually manifests here and is placed on someone else. But he said the power of it is at its point of origin. So the one who perpetrates and deliberately creates the suffering, far more intense for them. Now, it gets a little confusing, though, because there is something which Master called the conflicting cross currents of ego, which is the problem, and one of the reasons we learn so slowly, is that the cause and effect is often delayed. And so we look around at the world we're living in right now, and we see a whole lot of really ignorant people with a lot of power and prestige, doing all kinds of things that anyone with any sensitivity would not do. Horrifying things. I mean, I don't have to enumerate them for you. You all know they're just acting out around us. And naturally, one feels great compassion for the victims, but one also feels deep compassion for the perpetrators. Victims are suffering, and they have to go deep within themselves to find the power and the presence of God behind that suffering. I'll speak to that in just a moment. But the perpetrators are the ones who are setting themselves up, for the karmic retribution which will inevitably come. If it came immediately, instant karma is good karma. When you do the wrong thing and you immediately get kicked, that's great, because what's much more confusing is we go down the wrong path, wrong because it will not bring us happiness, but we go down it with such force that it takes a while for the karma to catch up with us. This is, unfortunately, the painful explanation for why things don't seem to make a lot of sense. But sometimes to be challenged with great suffering, odd as it may seem, is actually a blessing, because it gives us the opportunity from our own experience to decide, who am I? What is real? Where does my happiness come from? And in the reverse, the Ashwatthama tree, which is described in the Indian tradition, and I can't say more than is written in the few lines here, and it talks about the tree of life is upside down. The roots are upward and the branches go downward. Now this corresponds to esoteric aspects about the chakras and all of that. But it's very simple, because we experience it all the time. Whenever our energy is expanded and joyous, it's always upward moving, isn't it? I do that, I go like that. And I'm not going to say, what a horrible day. What you do is you collapse. I went through an intense experience in my life that was so intense, I literally fell to the ground weeping. And I had read about that in different places. I didn't know it was possible. But the grief was so intense that I couldn't even hold my body up, and I just fell. That is the downward, the branches reaching out. If you think of a tree, you think of the tree being strongly rooted and then reaching out in all directions. There's a gorgeous tree in the midst of our community, the elm that's over there by Master's Shrine. For those of you who've been there, those branches go in all directions. Now, we think of that as expansive, but where does the power of that tree come from? You can cut off all those branches and the tree still lives, doesn't it? But if you pull it up from the root, then it's finished. And so when we're talking about it being reversed, the roots are upward. So where do we go for our strength? I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my strength. It's not really that the mountain over there is the source of our energy. It's an inward. We lift our energy upward, and we experience it. Even before you know how to meditate or do anything like that, you experience it. And we find our when we're driven inside, that's when we discover who we are. Many years ago, my friend, who was an Episcopal priest and also a follower of this path in a Kriyaban, he thought it would be fun to take me to his ecumenical discussion group, because I was born into a Jewish family, and I'm a yogi and a Kriyaban, and I love Christ. He thought I would be marvelous for his Jewish Christian discussion group. Okay, yeah, it was a lot of things in one place. So anyway, we went to this group, and it was the Jewish people, the rabbis were in charge, and they were talking to the priests about the experience of Nazi Germany, of the Holocaust, as it's always called. And so there were these readings that we did, and all the readings were as you would expect them to be. I mean, this is just beyond human comprehension. But the knowledge of good and evil is planted in us, and people have to experience. And evil people perpetrated horrible things. But vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. We don't have to do it. It will come. Those who perpetrate are far worse than those who receive. Now, one of the rabbis writes, not one who was present, but one of the sources we're reading, says, those years were the shining hour for the Jewish people, because everything was taken away except their belief in God. And it was the opportunity to stand in that power, come what may. Now, not one of the other, I don't know who presented that as a source, because none of the rabbis and none of the priests wanted to talk about it. It seemed so interesting to me, and I made some minor efforts to get some attention to it and then realized nobody wanted to know. We just wanted to talk about lamentable evil and innocent suffering, and we just wanted to keep going like this. We just wanted to keep going in a circle. We wanted to keep looking outward, looking for solutions outwardly. And we can keep trying, and we can keep trying, and we can keep trying, and we do. We get to reincarnate as many times as we want. It's an unlimited coupon. You can just come back and come back and come back. And that was why when I was asking Swamiji, sir, I've had this compelling need to be happy, even though I am happy. I said, it doesn't make any sense to me. And he just looked at me and said, past lives. Past lives. Because what does suffering awaken within us? It compels us to try to find another answer. And the most magnificent thing about it, you see, is that it's a promise from God that he will keep. Once we really long to understand what causes suffering, where does happiness come from, then as soon as we really want to know. Swami talked about once he went to speak at it wasn't actually his alma mater, but the school that he attended, Brown University. And he gave a talk to the students there, and they kept it ongoing for a long time, asking him lots of questions. He said they were very interesting questions, very intelligent, interesting questions. He had fun answering them. But he knew that he didn't persuade a single person. it was just an intellectual exercise. He said they would go home and come up with new, better questions and just come back the next day. Doesn't matter how good the menu of the restaurant is if you're not hungry. You won't even go in. Doesn't matter how compelling the arguments are for spiritual life. If you don't long for it, you won't hear it. But once we begin, even the tiniest bit, begin to long for that truth, and maybe it's the company of a saint, maybe it's in one of the lifetimes, as Edgar Cayce spoke, where Jesus walked by and you just saw something there that opened your heart. Because planted within us is this reality. And we can ignore it literally for millions of incarnations. But something in us always knows that we were made for bliss and we were made for glory. If we didn't think that, we'd be very content with the mess that this world is. Why is it that we're not content? Because something in us knows that there's something really wrong here. When I was 10 years old, I remember staring out the window of our suburban house. And I thought if I just concentrated really hard, that it would actually, the delusion would dissolve. I was a Jewish girl living in El Paso, Texas. I mean, there was no context for this. It came out of past lives for sure. That I knew that this really wasn't it, and there was something behind it. And I thought if I just stared hard enough, it would come. How do we know that? Because it was planted in us. We know what is evil and we know what is good. And St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. And so we are compelled by our karma. The Gita talks at great length about how in action, if we refrain from acting, that itself is an act. There's all this long thing in English about action and inaction, and it goes on and on. But what we can't transcend by refusing to engage, by refusing to be committed. We transcend when we have the courage to follow every flow of energy to its end point and then learn from our experience. That's what Swamiji said when we confronted him about the sexual revolution back then. You're learning from experience, and it will be good, provided you are honest about your experience. And that was what Lahari was reading today, wasn't she? Truthfulness, to be able to see things as they actually are. Humility is self-honesty. Just to be able to say, this is what I did, and lovingly, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but now I have to be courageous enough to actually understand good and evil. Not out there, it's pretty easy to see, and there's a lot of shadow in the world we're living in. And Master has promised us there'll be more. Is that really bad karma for us, that there will be? Is it bad karma to have everything taken away from you except your inner reality? Is it bad karma to be forced to go upward to the root of who we are and to really know ourselves as God made us? We're masterful at distracting ourselves. If all those distractions are taken away, are we being blessed or are we being cursed? You see how very confusing it gets? That which is day to the yogi is night to the worldly man. That is night to the yogi is day to the worldly man. My poor man, that poor driver having a nervous breakdown in the car next to me, thought he was enjoying himself, and he apparently was. And let him continue. Let him have whatever experience he wants until he himself knows. But when, by the grace of God, some touch of that divine comes to us, we will never be content again. We'll try, but we never will be. But that's the good news, you see, is that the divine comes and keeps saying, really, you really think that's happiness? Let me give you a touch of true bliss. And once our feet are planted on that route, God will come. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow. But nothing else that we do holds the absolute guarantee of perfection except our oneness with God. What a blessed world this is, with all its shadow and all its suffering, because within it is the possibility of union with the divine. God bless you.